Snow fell in restless veils that night, not soft and playful as children dream of, but sharp and whispering, as if each flake carried a secret it would never tell. The lantern at the station swayed in the wind, its flame trembling against the storm, and in that uncertain glow sat a man the world had already cast aside. Takakota Greyhawk, scarred and bound to wheels that mocked his once mighty stride, seemed less a man than a statue carved from pain and silence. People turned their faces from him, pretending the wind demanded their attention, yet their whispers cut sharper than any blade. A mail-order bride, promised by letter and rumor, stepped off the train with silk gloves and painted cheeks, her eyes searching until they landed upon him. For a heartbeat, hope breathed in his chest, fragile as glass, the dream of a beginning. But when her gaze fell to the wheelchair, when her smile died like a flame strangled of air, the whole platform felt the chill of her rejection. She declared him unworthy, not with quiet honesty, but with a voice loud enough to break his spirit before the crowd. Snow gathered on his shoulders, his hair, his lashes, until he looked carved from ice, enduring judgment in stillness, because to move would mean surrender. The children laughed, emboldened by their mothers, and hurled snowballs at the giant who had once been feared, now mocked like a broken toy. And still he did not stir, because pride bound him tighter than iron, and the storm seemed kinder than their scorn. Among the jeering faces, one pair of eyes did not join the chorus of cruelty. Elsie Bell McGrath, slight as a reed in the wind, lingered at the far edge of the platform, her shawl threadbare, her shoes soaked, her heart aching with a recognition she could not name. She knew the sting of being unseen, the chill of being deemed unworthy. Watching him, her chest tightened as if the snow itself had pressed there, and something inside her whispered that perhaps her own loneliness had been waiting for this very moment. As the rejected bride vanished into the train's steam and the townsfolk scattered back to warmth, Elsie remained, her breath trembling in the cold. She saw the tracks his wheels carved into the snow, 2 lines leading away into the storm, fragile and vanishing, yet pulling her forward with invisible force. She felt within her chest the faint echo of a vow unspoken, a tender stirring that promised this was not the end, but the first thread of something greater. And so the story did not close on rejection, but tilted, ever so slightly, toward a beginning, toward a fragile path where 2 outcasts might find in each other the healing the world had denied them. For those who read these words, pause with me here. If love has ever found you in the darkest hour, you know it blooms where no one expects, like a lantern that refuses to be swallowed by storm. If this glimpse into a wounded man's silence and a quiet woman's courage touches your heart, I invite you. Leave a thought in the comments. Share what love has meant in your storms. Like, subscribe. Let your voice be part of this journey, so together we carry forward stories that heal, that warm, that remind us none of us are alone in the snow. And as Elsie takes her first trembling steps after him, we move with her, deeper into the storm, where the wheel tracks fade, but hope begins to blaze. Elsie followed the fading tracks in the snow, her shawl clutched close, though the wind cut through it like knives. Each mark left by his chair seemed etched not only upon the whiteness of the ground, but upon her own heart, grooves of loneliness carved deeper with every step. She told herself it was pity that moved her forward, but beneath that thought stirred something warmer, something healing, like an ember long buried beneath ash, beginning to glow again. The storm pressed against her, urging her back toward lighted windows and gossiping tongues, but she pressed on into the darkness where the giant had vanished. At the edge of town she found him, motionless in his chair, snow climbing his shoulders until he seemed part of the drift, a monument of sorrow abandoned by the world. His eyes were fixed on the emptiness before him, and for a moment she feared he had surrendered entirely, become more ghost than man. Her voice quivered when it broke the hush, but it carried with it a strength she did not know she possessed. She told him he should not sit alone, words fragile as frost, yet steady enough to reach him. Slowly, his head turned, dark eyes glistening though no warmth burned there. "Better alone," he murmured, voice rough, heavy with years of carrying shame. Yet she did not turn away. Instead, she stepped closer until the storm wrapped them both in its veil, until she could feel the gravity of his sorrow as if it were her own. "You're coming with me." The words left her lips before fear could steal them back. They were not born of pity, but of defiance, of a yearning to share warmth in a world that had given her little and taken even more. He narrowed his gaze, as if weighing cruelty against madness, disbelief pressing hard against hope. She lifted her chin, stubborn against the gale, and offered what little she had: a cabin, a fire, food enough for two. He turned away, his voice cold, claiming he needed no charity. Her heart trembled at the sting, but she stood her ground, telling him gently that it was not charity, not pity, but company, that she would not let the snow bury him here. The silence that followed was long, filled with the howl of the wind and the memory of laughter that still haunted him. His hands gripped the rims of his chair, torn between the pride that chained him and the fragile thread of kindness she held before him. And when he did not move, she moved for him, stepping behind his chair and placing her hands on the worn wood. The wheels groaned, but they turned beneath her push, carving new tracks into the whiteness. He did not resist, though his shoulders tightened, though his breath came sharp. Together they moved through streets still awake with gossiping eyes, the whispers biting sharper than the wind. Desperate girl, foolish girl, wasting herself on a broken man. Each word tried to slice her resolve, but she kept her gaze forward, each push of the wheels an act of healing for both of them. At last, the glow of her small cabin came into view, crouched against the storm, its crooked roof and sagging door promising little but shelter. Yet when she pushed him across the threshold, the world shifted. The howl of the storm fell behind, replaced by the crackle of a struggling fire and the scent of smoke and pine. Shadows danced on the walls, warming the edges of their silence. She stirred the hearth until flames rose steady, then placed before him what she could offer: a cup of broth, a hunk of bread, the fragile comfort of a place to belong. He stared, suspicion clouding his face, and told her he had no coin. She shook her head, quiet but resolute, saying she had never asked for payment. His eyes lifted then, searching hers, a question unspoken, and she answered simply, "Because no one should be left to freeze." For the first time his hard gaze softened, only a flicker, yet enough to kindle something fragile between them. He lifted the bread, hesitant, as though unsure he had the right, and each bite was heavy with surrender. She busied herself with tending the fire, her heart racing, Yet when he spoke again of strength lost and shame endured, she knelt before him, letting the glow of the flames touch her face, and whispered that she did not see the chair. She saw him. The words trembled in the air, daring, fragile, but true. He did not answer, yet his eyes did not turn away, and in the hush that followed, the storm battered at the walls while within something new began to take root. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of a bond strong enough to defy the cold and the cruelty of the world. And as the fire steadied, filling the cabin with warmth, Elsie sat across from him, her eyes unflinching, her heart still trembling, and felt for the first time in years that she was not alone. It was not yet love, but it was a light against the darkness, a fragile promise that the snow outside could not erase. Their silence stretched, not empty now, but healing, like a wound bound gently for the first time. And as night thickened, the question burned quietly between them, whether the path they had begun to walk would be their salvation or their undoing. The storm did not pass quickly. Days folded into one another, draped in veils of falling snow and the ceaseless groan of wind against the shutters. The cabin, once a refuge for one, now bore the presence of two, its silence shifting from emptiness into something fuller, heavier, and strangely healing. At first, Takakota lingered near the door as if unwilling to claim space, his great frame in the chair hunched against shadows, as though he were only a guest waiting for the moment to depart. But Elsie refused to let him remain at the threshold of her world. Each morning she pushed him nearer to the fire, placed bread and broth within his reach, and set wood where his scarred hands could find it. She would not allow the storm to bury him, not outside in the drifts, nor within himself. He resisted her care with the stubbornness of pride. On one dawn, when the snow pressed thickest against the windows, she woke to the sound of wheels grinding. He was struggling at the door, muscles straining, sweat shining on his scarred chest, though the cold rushed in like a predator. She darted forward, her hair loose around her face, her hands gripping the rims of his chair. He snarled that he would not be a burden, his voice fierce as the blizzard itself, his arms shaking with the effort to force himself back into the storm. She held on, breathless, refusing to let go. "You'll kill yourself out there," she cried, but his eyes burned with pride and sorrow, insisting he would not watch her wear herself thin for him. The storm bit at her ankles, snow twisting into the cabin, but she stood her ground, trembling yet unyielding. Her voice broke open then, raw and healing at once, that she had been alone too long, that he gave her more than he understood. He gave her company, a reason to rise each day, proof that she was not invisible. His anger faltered. The fire of his pride dimmed as her words pierced a place long buried. Slowly, his hands loosened, and she guided him back inside. For the first time, he allowed her to pull a quilt across his legs, and the silence that followed was not heavy with shame, but fragile with trust. As the days deepened, their rhythm softened into something that resembled life shared. Takakota began to mend what his strong hands could still command, carving handles from wood, repairing broken hinges, sharpening the axe, though he could not swing it. Elsie learned to leave the tools where he could reach them, not as an act of charity, but as an acknowledgement of partnership. Meals became rituals of quiet companionship, their silences stretching long but no longer hollow. The fire became their witness, its glow painting the lines of his scars and the determination in her young face. Outside, the storm piled higher, but within, warmth flickered steady, a light no gossip could extinguish. Yet the world beyond their walls did not rest. Whenever Elsie went into town to barter cloth or broth, tongues lashed sharp as whips. Martha Lauderdale sneered that she was trading her youth for ruin. Sheriff Amos shook his head, warning her she would regret the path she had chosen. Children mimicked the groan of Takakota's wheels, their laughter cruel in its thoughtlessness. Each return home left her shoulders bowed under more than the weight she carried. One evening she set her basket down with trembling hands, her eyes glistening though no tears fell. Takakota wheeled toward her, his chair creaking, his jaw tight. He asked what they had said, though the answer was already carved in her silence. She forced steadiness into her voice and told him it was nothing she hadn't heard before, that she was desperate, foolish, wasting herself. His hands curled hard on the rims, anger and shame rising together. But she lifted her chin, her voice clear, even through the tremor of pain. They judged her not because of him, she said, but because they could not understand what they had never felt, and she would not live by their measure. In that moment, something shifted in him. The weight of his shame wavered, replaced by a fragile pride, not in himself, but in her. He bowed his head, not in defeat, but in reverence, and in her eyes he glimpsed a kind of strength more unbreakable than any he had once carried in his legs. That night, as the storm roared outside, Elsie hummed softly while mending a shirt by firelight. The tune was cracked but steady, a melody stitched from endurance. Takakota listened, his scarred hands resting still, and the sound seeped into the hollows he had long believed lifeless. His chest rose with a breath that felt new, cleansing, as though her voice was a thread binding together the pieces of him the world had tried to scatter. Winter pressed harder, demanding more from them both. Elsie's hands grew raw from hauling water, her palms blistered from chopping kindling, yet she smiled more often, her burden lightened by purpose shared. Takakota, though bound to his chair, guided her with knowledge of the land, teaching her to set snares, to stretch broth with herbs, to listen for the hidden life within the woods. One evening she returned with a rabbit, caught by his teaching, her cheeks flushed with triumph. She laid it before him proudly, and their eyes met in a silence that carried more than gratitude. It carried recognition of a fragile home built not by chance, but by the quiet, stubborn will of two souls the world had cast aside. And yet, even as their bond deepened within the cabin's walls, the whispers outside grew sharper. Each word of scorn thrown her way was another stone pressing down on her shoulders. Takakota saw the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. He knew the burden was his as much as hers. Late one night in the low glow of firelight, he whispered that she would be free if he left. Elsie turned to him, her quilt slipping from her lap, her voice steady despite the glisten in her eyes. If he left, she said, the scorn would remain. It always had. But if he stayed, at least it meant something. Her words struck him with the force of truth, cutting through years of believing that dignity lay only in walking upright again. Perhaps dignity was also found in being chosen, in being needed, in refusing to let shame dictate the worth of a life. Snow heaped against the cabin, sealing them in, but inside the fire glowed steady. They sat in its warmth, two outcasts bound not by pity, but by the healing grace of survival shared. Beyond the door, the storm of the world gathered still, but within those fragile walls something stronger was being forged. It was not yet the triumphant blaze of love declared, but it was its beginning, the quiet, stubborn spark that even the cruelest whispers could not snuff out. And as the snow pressed higher, as judgment pressed harder, the question remained unspoken but alive between them. How long could such fragile light withstand the world's shadow? The thaw did not come with gentleness, but with a sudden, merciless shift, the kind that turned snow into slush and made every step through town a struggle. Elsie wrapped her thin shawl tighter as she carried her basket of mended linens, her shoulders straight, though the weight of whispers pressed harder than the wind. She walked past shuttered windows and half-curtains pulled aside by curious hands, past voices that sharpened with scorn. Silas Boone, the rancher whose laughter had long followed Takakota like a curse, cornered her outside the mercantile. His breath smelled of whiskey, his words slurred but sharpened by cruelty. He told her she was wasting herself on a man who could not stand, offered her the false promise of a life with someone whole. She pulled herself free, chin high, but the laughter he spat after her clung to her like a stain. When she returned to the cabin, her steps faltered, her hands trembling as she set the basket down. Takakota wheeled forward swiftly, his face hardening at the sight of her unspoken pain. She tried to brush it away, to say it was nothing new, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He asked her what had been said, and when her lips finally parted, the name Silas fell between them like poison. Fury surged in him, not the quiet, buried kind that lived under his scars, but fire, raw and consuming. He would not let her carry the weight of another man's mockery. Before she could stop him, his hands gripped the rims of his chair, and with a force that shook the cabin itself, he thrust himself into the storm. Snow clung to his shoulders, his scars bared to the cold, but his arms moved with a thunder that defied pity. Through the streets he rolled, the sound of wheels carving defiance into the slush. The town hushed as he passed. Men at the saloon door straightened. Women paused at their washing lines. Children stilled mid-laughter. The giant once mocked was no longer a shadow, but a storm of his own, his eyes blazing, his breath clouding like smoke from a fire too long buried. He found Silas leaning against a post, grin crooked, fists ready for cruelty. Words were exchanged, Silas sneering that a heart could not chop wood or plough fields or keep a woman warm. But Takakota's voice carried louder, steadier, that a man was measured not by the legs beneath him, but by the heart he carried. His words rippled through the air, shaking loose the certainty of every mocking tongue. Silas stepped forward, his hand curling into a fist, ready to strike. But before the blow could fall, Elsie moved between them, her small frame lit by pale winter light, her shawl whipping in the wind. Her cheeks flushed, her voice clear. She declared that the only shame belonged not to the man in the chair, but to those who mocked what they did not understand. Her words were sharp as truth itself, slicing through the silence. A murmur rose in the crowd, scandal mixing with awe. For the first time, Sheriff Amos's eyes softened, his hand hovering at his holster, his weight leaning not with Silas, but with them. Silas's sneer faltered, his fist dropping as the crowd's gaze shifted. He retreated into the saloon's shadows, muttering curses that carried less conviction than before. Takakota lifted his chin, his scars catching the pale light, and for once there was no shame upon his face, only dignity reclaimed. The whispers that had circled them for weeks faltered, and silence took their place. Elsie's hand touched his shoulder then, light as falling snow, and together they turned away, the wheels of his chair cutting fresh tracks through the slush. The crowd parted without mockery this time, without laughter, their silence heavy with something that might almost have been respect. Back at the cabin, Elsie lit the fire with trembling hands, her breath uneven from the weight of what had just been defied. Takakota watched her, the flame rising steady as though it too had found new strength. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, not from exhaustion, but from a quiet awakening inside him. For the first time he felt that he had stood, though his legs remained still, though his body bore scars. He had stood for her, with her, against a world that sought to break them. And she had not faltered, had not cowered, but had lifted her voice as shield and sword. He told her in the low quiet of the hearth that the town would never forgive them, that scorn would sharpen again with time. But Elsie, eyes glistening in the firelight, whispered back that they would never ask forgiveness. Her words wrapped around him like the quilt she so often draped across his lap, fragile, simple, yet more healing than any strength he had once possessed. Outside, the wind howled, piling snow against the door, promising more trials yet to come. But inside, for the first time, silence carried no weight of shame. It was the silence of two souls who had faced cruelty and stood unbroken. And as night closed in, Takakota sat in the glow of the fire, her presence beside him, soft but unyielding, and understood that what bound them was no longer pity, no longer loneliness shared, but something fiercer, something warmer, the beginning of love that had defied an entire town's scorn. Yet even as peace settled into that fragile cabin, he knew the world would test them again, that storms yet unseen waited beyond the horizon. Still, when her hand lingered in his, when her eyes met his without fear, he felt for the first time in years that no storm could truly undo them. And with that knowledge, their story moved forward, deeper into the fire of trial, but steadied by a love that already refused to break. Snow lay heavy upon the land, burying fences, silencing fields, pressing against the cabin roof until the rafters groaned with the strain. The world seemed made only of whiteness and silence, yet within those walls the fire still glowed, and two hearts beat steady, tethered to one another by fragile threads of survival, and a bond that grew deeper each passing day. Elsie's shawl grew thinner, her hands red and cracked from endless labor, but she carried on with quiet resilience, as if each burden was lighter, simply because she no longer bore it alone. She walked each week into town with jars of broth, scraps of cloth, and snares from Takakota's teaching, her steps steady though the weight of scorn pressed against her like the snow-laden wind. Faces turned, tongues lashed sharper than knives, but she held her head high, knowing that within her cabin there was warmth greater than the world's cruelty. Takakota watched her with a heart that ached. From the window he saw the tremor in her shoulders when she thought no one was looking, the way her hands sometimes shook as she set down her basket, the way she forced her smile to hide the wounds cut by whispers. Guilt gnawed at him, the old belief returning, that his presence chained her to suffering, that her strength was being poured out to hold up the ruins of a broken man. One evening, as firelight flickered across the floorboards, he whispered that she would be free of their scorn if he left. His voice was low, heavy with resignation, carrying the belief that dignity for her could be found only in his absence. Elsie turned from her seat, the quilt slipping from her lap, her eyes steady though wet with unshed tears. "If you leave, the scorn remains," she said, her voice quiet but carved of iron. "It always has. But if you stay, at least it means something." The words struck him like a blade and like a balm, cutting through the frost of his doubt and soothing the wound it left behind. For years he had believed that worth was bound only to strength of body, to legs that could carry him across plains, to battles fought and won. But now, in her eyes, he saw another truth. Dignity could be found in being chosen, in being needed, in standing unyielding, even if standing meant nothing more than sitting tall against the storm. The days thickened with snow, each one another test of endurance. Elsie worked until her breath came in ragged clouds, her body thinner, her face paler, yet she still smiled when she laid food upon the table, still hummed broken melodies while mending by the fire. Takakota took what weight he could from her shoulders, dragging buckets of water across the floor with arms that ached, feeding the fire with hands raw from the cold, guiding her with knowledge of snares and herbs, teaching her to stretch little into enough. Together they built not merely survival, but a rhythm of belonging. It was not pity she offered him, and not only protection he gave her. It was companionship that healed them both in ways neither had believed possible. But winter sharpened its claws, and the world beyond their door grew crueler still. One day Elsie returned from town, her face pale, her steps faltering. She set down her basket and coughed into her hand, the sound thin and ragged. Takakota wheeled forward, his heart seizing at the sight. Fever soon followed, seizing her body with trembling shivers, burning her cheeks with unnatural fire. He carried her to the bed with arms strong enough to lift, though his legs lay lifeless, placing her beneath quilts, pressing a damp cloth to her brow. Night after night he sat vigil, his scarred hands steady as he fed the fire, fetched water, whispered prayers in the tongue of his people, words old as rivers, meant to call strength back to the living. He told her stories as she drifted between fevered dreams, stories of his childhood, of horses thundering across the plains, of rivers that carried the voices of ancestors. His voice, rough and low, filled the cabin with a music that carried more hope than medicine. He prayed when she could not hear, his whispers breaking like ice under weight, pleading with a silence that offered no answer. Each shallow breath she drew broke him further, until he realized that the man he once believed a burden now lived only for the fragile rise and fall of her chest. His heart, once armored in shame, now lay bare, and he wept unashamed beside her. Days blurred into one another until at last a pale dawn carried mercy. Her fever broke, her lashes fluttered open, her eyes clouded but alive. She reached for his face with trembling fingers, brushing his cheek as though she had returned from some far-off shore to find him waiting. His breath caught, tears burning down his scarred cheeks as he whispered that he thought he had lost her. Her voice, faint but steady, replied with words that healed deeper than any fire. "You never will." In that moment, something inside him broke free. No longer would he live at the edges of life. No longer would he bow beneath the scorn of a world blind to the truth of what love could make. He knew then that they could not remain shadows, hidden in a cabin, while whispers tore at their lives. They must claim before the world what the storm had already witnessed, that they belonged to each other. Her survival was not only a mercy, but a vow renewed, and he would carry her forward even if the world spat its judgment. So when she was strong enough, wrapped in quilts, her hand resting light on his shoulder, he wheeled her through the streets of town. Doors opened, faces peered, gossip spilled like smoke, but awe followed as well. For there, before them all, moved the giant once mocked, scarred and bound to wheels, yet bearing with him a woman who leaned on him as though he were the last safe place in the world. Whispers cut the air, sharp with scandal, but also softened by something that had not existed before: respect. They moved together toward the chapel, where candles burned against the cold, and where vows waited like the dawn after a long night. And as the bell tolled across the snow-laden town, echoing into the stillness, Takakota knew that love, born in defiance of shame and nourished in the silence of a storm, would now be declared before every doubting eye. Their bond was no longer fragile, no longer hidden. It was a flame that would not bow to wind, a healing that could not be denied. What had begun as rejection had become resilience, and resilience had grown into love strong enough to carry them both beyond scorn, beyond survival, into a future claimed not by pity, but by choice. The chapel stood small against the whiteness of the morning, its wooden beams creaking beneath the weight of snow, its windows lit by trembling candlelight that spilled gold into the frost. The bell had already tolled, summoning the curious, the scandal-hungry, and the rare few whose hearts still softened at the sight of courage. Takakota wheeled forward with Elsie at his side, her frail body swathed in quilts, her hand resting on his scarred shoulder as though her strength had been transferred into him through that fragile touch. The crowd parted in silence, not in kindness, but in awe, as though they did not yet know whether to sneer or bow their heads. He felt their eyes, the sting of judgment sharp as sleet, yet for the first time it did not bend his spine. He carried her forward with dignity, every push of his wheels echoing like thunder across the slush-filled street. Inside the chapel, the air was thick with expectation. Martha Lauderdale's sharp whispers fluttered like blades in the pews, scandal glowing in her eyes, as though she had waited her whole life for this very moment. Silas Boone lingered near the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk cutting across his face, his bitterness coiled and ready to strike. Sheriff Amos stood stiff-backed, his hand near his holster, his gaze steady on the couple, as if measuring the weight of what was about to unfold. The preacher at the altar fumbled with his notes, his voice hesitant as he cleared his throat. He saw not only two souls before him, but the entire town's judgment pressing against his words. Takakota and Elsie moved forward together. He wheeled her close to the altar, the sound of wood against wood filling the silence, the marks of his wheels carved into the very floor as though leaving proof of their defiance. He lifted his chin, his scars lit by the trembling light of candles, and for once there was no shame written across his face. Elsie sat straighter beside him, her thin frame fragile as glass, yet her eyes gleamed with a strength fierce enough to silence storms. Their hands found one another, hers small and delicate, his broad and scarred, and in that clasp the hush deepened, no longer heavy with scorn, but edged with reverence. The preacher began, his words faltering, "Do you, Elsie Bell McGrath?" But before he could finish, Silas's voice cut through the hush like a blade. "This is a mockery," he spat, his laugh echoing bitter against the rafters. "A cripple at the altar, swearing vows he cannot uphold. It ain't fit, and you know it." Gasps rippled through the crowd, scandal blooming hot, eager tongues ready to feast. Martha Lauderder's hands clutched her shawl in satisfaction, as though she had been vindicated at last. But Elsie, pale though she was, rose from her place with trembling strength. She stood not as a frail girl, but as a woman carved from fire and love, her voice ringing out clear as a bell. "The only mockery is the cruelty of men who measure worth by what they see, and not by the soul." Her words fell heavy, and the room stilled. Silas's smirk faltered, his fists clenched, yet he did not step forward. Sheriff Amos shifted, his presence leaning firm, his eyes narrowing with something like respect. For the first time, authority stood not with the cruel, but against them. The preacher's voice steadied, emboldened by the fire in Elsie's tone, and he asked again, his words truer this time, "Do you, Elsie Bell McGrath, take this man?" She turned her gaze to Takakota, her eyes glistening but unwavering. "I do," she said, without hesitation, without fear, each syllable woven with healing and truth. "And do you, Takakota Greyhawk?" The words carried through the hush like a drumbeat. Takakota's chest swelled, his breath thick with emotion, and his voice came low but thunderous, shaking the very walls. "I do." In those two words, the years of shame cracked and fell away. In those two words, he claimed not only a woman's hand, but his own dignity, his right to love, his place in a world that had tried to banish him. The preacher declared them bound, his voice trembling yet firm, and in that moment something shifted in the air itself. The whispers changed, no longer sharpened with scorn, but softened by awe. Even those who still clung to bitterness could not deny what had been forged before them. Snow swirled beyond the windows, falling like blessings from a sky once cruel. Elsie leaned into him, her head against his chest, her hand tight in his, and Takakota's arms folded around her as though she were the only truth he had ever needed. The scars across his body no longer felt like marks of disgrace, but proof of endurance, proof that he had lived long enough to find this moment. Around them, candles flickered, shadows bent, and the town sat hushed, caught between what had been and what was yet to come. But in Takakota's heart, peace was not whole. His eyes caught the figure of Silas, still lingering in the shadows, his scowl unbroken, his bitterness unyielding. The world beyond the chapel was not yet conquered, the battles not yet ended. He knew storms would rise again, judgment would sharpen once more, but when Elsie whispered against his chest, "We are not alone any more," the storm inside him quieted. Her words were promise, her presence a healing balm. Whatever trial still waited, they would face it not as outcasts abandoned, but as two souls bound by choice, by love, by a flame strong enough to burn through snow and shadow alike. The doors burst open then, a gust of wind scattering snow down the aisle, extinguishing some candles, bending the rest toward the cold. Yet even as the light flickered and shadows threatened, Takakota's grip on her hand held steady, his chest rising against hers, a vow unshaken. They had been joined not only by words spoken at an altar, but by every moment of scorn endured, every kindness shared, every silence that had healed them both. And as the storm raged on outside, within the chapel, their union blazed like a fire, refusing to die. It was not the end, but the beginning of a greater defiance, one that would carry them into trials yet unseen. Snow stretched endless across the plains, an ocean of white beneath a sky sagging with its own heavy weight. The cabin crouched small against it, its chimney breathing thin trails of smoke, its windows aglow with the fragile light of fire. Within, Takakota and Elsie lived not in splendor, but in the quiet rhythm of shared survival, each day binding them closer, weaving their lives together with threads that could not be torn by scorn. Their union had been sealed before the town, defiant and unyielding, but marriage was not an end. It was the beginning of a deeper trial, the proving of vows against hunger, storm, and the sharpened tongues of those who still muttered in shadows. Elsie, though frail from fever's passing, bent herself to tasks with the same resolve that had carried her through loneliness. Her hands stitched, kneaded, lifted and carried, red and cracked from labour, yet steady in their devotion. She laughed more often now, a soft, fragile music that filled the cabin like a balm, turning silence into warmth. Takakota watched her with eyes that had once held only the dark weight of shame. Now he saw in her the resilience of flame, small yet steady, and he learned to measure his strength not by what his legs could not do, but by how his arms lifted the burdens she could not bear alone. He dragged water with hands strong as stone, split kindling until his palms bled, and when the weight of exhaustion bent him, he still found a way to carry her spirit higher with his presence, his voice, his unbroken will. At times, the world outside seemed to soften. Sheriff Amos no longer looked on him with suspicion, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as though something within the lawman had shifted when Elsie had spoken in the chapel. Even Martha Lauderdale, her tongue still sharp, now cloaked her venom in whispers rather than open jeers, for the tide of scorn had been broken by vows no one could erase. Yet Silas Boone remained in the shadows, his bitterness festering, his gaze cold whenever it fell upon them. He lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon, waiting for the moment to strike. Takakota felt it, the weight of the man's hate, yet he no longer bowed beneath it. He understood now that love did not banish trials, it armed him to meet them. As winter deepened, storms grew harsher, sealing them inside for days at a time. But within those walls there bloomed a world untouched by cruelty. They sat together at night by the hearth, Elsie curled against his side, her head resting against his chest, listening to the slow thunder of his heart. He told her stories of rivers and plains, of his people's songs, his voice low and steady, carrying healing into the marrow of her bones. She hummed soft replies, melodies stitched from fragments of memory, weaving her own broken music into his. In those hours, time bent, and the cabin became a sanctuary, a place where scars were not marks of shame, but proof of survival, proof that they had been carried through storms into one another's arms. Yet the trials of the body are not easily silenced. One evening, as snow pressed against the windows and the fire burned low, Elsie staggered as she carried wood. The logs spilled from her arms, her body folding beneath exhaustion. Takakota wheeled forward, gathering her into his arms, his chest heavy with the fear of losing her again. He laid her upon the bed, brushing the damp from her brow, his scarred hands trembling as he whispered that she bore too much alone. She smiled faintly, her voice soft but unshaken, telling him that her life had been empty before he came, that what she carried now was not burden, but meaning. Her words filled him with a warmth deeper than fire, a healing truth that silenced the echoes of shame still clinging to his heart. When spring's thaw finally broke through the frozen earth, the land breathed again, rivers swelling with melted snow, grass pushing through frost. With it came whispers of change. Some in town no longer spat cruelty when they saw them together. Some even nodded in silence, a quiet acceptance that grew from the roots of defiance. Their love, once mocked, now became a tale whispered with reluctant awe. And though Silas's shadow still lingered, darker for the light it despised, Takakota and Elsie walked together without bowing, their steps steady, their silence stronger than words. They began to build more than survival. Takakota carved a stronger door, fashioned tools from scraps of iron and wood, his hands reclaiming purpose. Elsie planted seeds in soil darkened by thaw, her fingers trembling with both weakness and hope, knowing that life could push through even after the hardest winter. Together, they shaped not just a home, but a life that defied the world's cruelty. Each act of labor, each shared meal, each night spent in the warmth of fire and silence became a vow renewed. Their love was not grand in gesture, not gilded by riches, but fierce in its quiet constancy, like the steady beating of a heart that refuses to stop. And yet, deep within them both, lived the knowledge that storms still waited, that bitterness in men like Silas would not vanish, that hardship would return as surely as winter. But they also knew that love had already proven itself against scorn, fever, and hunger. It had endured the lash of tongues and the weight of snow. It had bound two outcasts into something stronger than the world's judgment. When Elsie laid her hand in his, when Takakota leaned his scarred forehead against hers in the hush before sleep, they both understood. Whatever trial awaited, they would face it as one. And with that certainty, their story pressed forward, deeper into the unknown, carrying the warmth of a love that had already withstood more than most hearts could bear. Summer bled slow across the land, a fragile warmth spreading where snow had once ruled, and the world began to breathe again. Grass grew high along the slopes, wildflowers spread like spilled paint across meadows, and the river swelled, carrying with it the promise of life reborn. Yet even as the season turned, Takakota and Elsie carried winter within them, not as a wound, but as a bond, a reminder that their love had been born in storm and silence, tempered by hunger, fever, and the cruel weight of judgment. Every dawn that spilled into their small cabin felt like a miracle, not because it promised ease, but because it promised another day together. Takakota worked with steady hands, carving wood into tools, mending what the harsh months had broken, his broad frame bent to tasks with the dignity of purpose reclaimed. Elsie moved softly through the cabin and fields, her voice humming low as she tended to seedlings sprouting fragile in the soil. Sometimes she would pause, her hands resting on her knees, her breath thin, her body still healing from all it had endured. Takakota would wheel beside her, his shadow falling across the earth, and lift the labor from her shoulders. She would smile then, faint but luminous, as though her strength was doubled by the very act of being seen, of being loved without condition. The town, too, began to shift. Where once there had been laughter sharp as knives, there now lingered silence, and in silence grew something like reluctant respect. Children no longer threw snow at his chair. Instead, they watched him with eyes wide, whispering not of a broken man, but of a giant who carried scars as proof of survival. Sheriff Amos nodded when their paths crossed, a subtle recognition that dignity could not be taken from one who had already reclaimed it. Even Martha Lauderdale, her tongue still restless, now whispered behind curtains rather than daring to strike openly. Yet Silas Boone remained unchanged, his bitterness growing darker, his shadow long upon every gathering. Takakota felt it each time their eyes met, the promise of storm yet to come. But when he turned his face back toward Elsie, when he saw her eyes lit not by fear but by quiet resolve, the storm lost its teeth. Nights in the cabin became a rhythm of healing. They sat close by the hearth, even in summer, the fire more symbol than need, a reminder of how its warmth had once kept them alive when the world froze. Elsie leaned against his chest, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, listening to the deep thunder of his heart. He told her stories in the low music of his voice, stories of rivers that had never frozen, of horses that once ran wild across endless plains, of a boy who had been called strong before the world tried to break him. She answered not with words, but with presence, her fingers tracing the scars across his hands, her humming folding into the silence until it became music enough to heal them both. One evening, as the sun melted into gold along the horizon, Elsie spoke words that cut through the hush with a quiet strength. That love was not meant to be hidden in shadows, that their bond was not shameful, but sacred. Takakota's breath caught at her courage, the same courage that had stood in a chapel and silenced a room. He realized then that love was not only a balm against pain, but a defiance, a living flame that dared to exist where the world had tried to smother it. In her eyes he saw not frailty, but the steady blaze of a soul that would not bow, and in that blaze his own spirit stood taller than any mountain. They walked together through seasons, carrying one another's weight with grace. When the fields demanded toil, they worked side by side. When illness whispered at the edges, they bore it together, his hands steady, her voice healing. When the town's whispers returned, sharper on some days than others, they met them with silence that spoke louder than defense, silence woven with love that had already proven itself unbreakable. And each time Takakota's chair cut tracks through mud or dust, Elsie walked beside him, her hand light upon his shoulder, a promise that wherever he went, she went too. Love became not a fragile ember, but a hearth fire that refused to die. It burned in the way she laughed, soft and unguarded, as though laughter had once been foreign to her, but now lived freely on her lips. It burned in the way he watched her, his dark eyes no longer lowered in shame, but lifted, steady with pride. It burned in the way they held each other at night, wrapped in quilts, listening not to the world's cruelty, but to the shared rhythm of breath that said simply, "We are alive, and we are not alone." And though the future carried its shadows, though storms lingered on the horizon, they no longer feared them. For what is love, if not the courage to stand in the storm with another, to believe that even in the fiercest wind, a hand in yours is enough to make the world bearable? Their story had begun in scorn and rejection, but it unfolded into something the world could not undo. a love stronger than shame, warmer than fire, and more healing than time itself. If you have felt the weight of storms, if you have known loneliness or shame, let this story remind you that light blooms even in the coldest winter. Love finds us where the world least expects it, and it saves us in ways no strength of body ever could. If these words warmed your heart, if this tale of two outcasts finding belonging stirred something inside you, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Leave a comment, let your voice join theirs. Press like if the fire of their love touched you. Subscribe if you wish to walk further into stories that heal and inspire. Together, let us carry forward this truth, that love, once chosen, can never be broken.